Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Local Government Aquatic Invasive Species Toolkit, presented by the National Sea Grant Law Center and Creative Resource Strategies. Our project was supported with funding by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Today's webinar will be recorded and the presentation will be made available on the new Local Government AIS website at www.localgovais.com, as well as the National Sea Grant Law Center website. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type those questions into the question box and we'll have a Q&A at the conclusion of the presentation. Because of the number of people participating in today's webinar, all of you will be on mute to ensure the integrity of the sound quality of the recording and to minimize any background noise. Today's presenters are Stephanie Otts, Director of the National Sea Grant Law Center in the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant Legal Program at the University of Mississippi School of Law, as well as myself, Lisa Debricare, President of Creative Resource Strategies. I thought I'd give Stephanie an opportunity to introduce herself, though, and share a little bit about her work with invasive species. So go ahead, Steph.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Lisa. Yes, so I'm the director of the National Sea Grant Law Center. We are part of the NOAA, National Sea Grant College Program, established to provide legal education, research, and outreach to Sea Grant and its constituents. And so we have invasive species is one of our focus areas here at the National Sea Grant Law Center, and we have been involved in a number of projects looking at the laws and policies around invasive species management, including leading up efforts to develop a model legal framework for watercraft inspection and decontamination in partnership with the Western states. And we're currently working with the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission to assist them with a harmonization project they are doing with regards to state invasive species lists. So we're very excited about this opportunity to look at the local government level.
Thanks, Stephanie. And as I said, my name is Lisa Debricare. I'm President of Creative Resource Strategies. I've been working with the Western states and Canadian provinces for close to 15 years now, working on a variety of natural resource issues, including invasive species, both terrestrial and aquatic. Stephanie and I have been colleagues for quite a period of time, probably since the kickoff of that first meeting in Phoenix, Arizona, which ultimately launched Building Consensus in the West and a number of other initiatives that have allowed the states to work closely together to advance their aquatic invasive species regulations. So it's a pleasure for us to both be here today and to talk with you about what we consider to be a really important project and one that involved a number of people throughout the United States in local municipalities. So Steph, I'll turn it back to you to share some of the background information.
Great, thanks. So today we're excited to share our new local government aquatic invasive species toolkit. In the webinar today, our plan is to provide a bit of background on the project, including our purpose, goals, and processes that we use to develop the tool. And then we'll walk you through the website and its content, and there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. So next slide. So project background. So this project was funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to help explore the connections between federal, tribal, state, and local governments regarding invasive species. So throughout our work on invasive species, Lisa and I have noticed that local governments aren't often included in the conversation, even though there are significant roles that they can and do play in prevention and containment efforts. And so in this project, we really wanted to dig into that, to look at the various layers of government roles and responsibilities with respect to invasive species prevention. And while these roles are often overlapping, there are distinct aspects to each level, and those can also vary depending on the species and pathways. So it's a very complicated, complex mix of government responsibilities, which is really interesting to explore. Next slide. So despite being often overlooked, invasive species, as I'm sure all of you on the call know, can impose significant costs on local governments. And so just two examples, kind of recent examples, water officials in Lake Austin, Texas are facing additional control costs of $200,000 to $1 million per year to be able to deliver clean, odorless water to their customers, which was impacted due to a zebra mussel infestation. And the city of Burlington, Vermont estimates that it would cost $1.35 million to remove ash trees to prevent the spread of emerald ash borer. And counties across the country spend millions to prevent and control noxious weeds, as they're often the on-the-ground kind of managers and responders to those species. Next slide. So although the extent of their authority varies by state, cities and counties generally have the ability to enact and enforce local laws to protect the welfare, safety, and health of their citizens. And so municipalities, local governments often have the authority to enact ordinances that address invasive species risks as long as they don't conflict with state law. For example, most cities could enact an ordinance prohibiting the planting of non-native species in city parks or on city property. Different levels of government that work together to collaboratively address invasive species can more efficiently prevent, mitigate, and control invasive species risks than they can if they're making policy separately or not really working together. However, local government efforts to address invasive species risks are generally not mobilized in a coordinated or effective manner. And so in the creation of this toolkit, we decided to look at management by pathways and vectors. And so how can these efforts be more coordinated? And we know that addressing invasive species through pathway management is more efficient and effective than species by species. So there's a whole range of pathways that are important. And Lisa will talk more about this later when she kind of walks through the toolkit. And so as I mentioned earlier, federal and state management plans often overlook the role of local governments. Here are just a few examples that, federal and state plans rarely identify, define, or even discuss the role that local governments can play in achieving the plan's goals. And we argue that that they're missing a lot by not doing that, because this is a government entity that really has important roles to play. Next slide. Okay, so specifically for this project, so I mentioned that it was funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and there were two components of it. One was to develop municipal case studies to document the planning framework used to identify high-risk priority AIS and their pathways, as well as potential opportunities to influence policy or take measures to enhance prevention and control. And then to, in addition, produce an online handbook toolkit for local entities that provide resources to guide them through this process. How can you really evaluate what your high-risk pathways are? What do you currently have available with respect to your laws and ordinances? And then what might be next steps to improve those programs? And so for the case studies, we set out to select case studies that were very diverse. We wanted to highlight water bodies from across the country that had a mix of urban and rural settings, jurisdictional situations, so some that had many local governments kind of surrounding the water body versus maybe one that was just within one jurisdiction. Also different federal relationships, such as the Corps of Engineers reservoir or the presence of a national wildlife refuge. But then, of course, the willingness of local officials to participate was important in the final selection of the case studies. Although with COVID, local officials, it became kind of even harder in some respects to divert their attention. But we're really pleased with the mix that we were able to provide?
Thanks, Stephanie. So the process that we used to develop the online toolkit, first we did a lot of background research to gather information about the potential case studies throughout the United States. And then we conducted a series of interviews with some of these local entities to gauge their interest, to assess the complexity of the AIS issues locally, to better understand what's been done in the past to address past issues, but also how these entities were thinking about emerging issues and what steps that they could take to prepare for new introductions, to prevent the spread, etc. So we worked with these different entities to identify high priority AIS and then really look at those priority pathways and sub-pathways of introduction. Most of you that are on this webinar today have a great deal of experience with aquatic invasive species, and so you know the importance of identifying those priority pathways and really thinking strategically about how to intercept those pathways. We also talked with these entities about who the responsible cities or county departments were, or other local governments that might exist that have been managing the water body and or have a strong interest in that water body being healthy for recreational purposes, for drinking water purposes, etc. We looked at also different state laws and regulations that may govern the management of that water body. We looked at local ordinances or other authorities, such as any leases that might exist for management of seaplanes, for example, or any other pathway. And then we worked with these entities to discuss potential recommendations as well. Once we did all of this background information and conducted the research and worked with the local entities, we drafted the website, and then we did a webinar with these local entities to look at their case studies, refine them further, look at the recommendations that we were proposing, and then we put the finishing touches on the website itself. And so we did develop the website, and I'm going to go ahead and call that up for you now here. So give me a second here to pull it over. And it is called localgovais.com. And so its purpose is to assist local governments with navigating the regulatory framework. And we've gotten some pretty good feedback on the website so far from entities that have been struggling over the past few years to think about the role that they could play at the local municipality level. In fact, we heard from one of our colleagues just in the last week that if this website had existed several years ago as they were developing their program, it would have been really instrumental in helping them to build out their program more quickly and efficiently. So I wanted to walk through the website with you to share some elements of it. We just put a little bit about the background. We know that most of the entities that are going to be using this website have some experience with AIS in general. So we didn't feel like we wanted to create this huge backdrop of aquatic invasive species and why are they important. There's tons of websites out there. And so we wanted to be really efficient and focused with the content of this website. So just a little bit about the background in emphasizing the role that local governments can play in invasive species prevention efforts. The regulatory framework has several different pieces to it. And the first one that we developed was a very simple decision tree. So if you're a local entity and you're trying to figure out, should I even get in this game of thinking about local regulations? Or is this something that I really should leave to federal and state authorities which have regulations in place? Will that take care of the issue that I'm thinking about? And so it's a really simple yes/no decision tree. And if you walk through that tree and answer some of the questions, you end up determining that there is no need to create a local regulation. And if you walk through another part of the tree, there's no need to create an additional regulation. And then the third place you come to is, yeah, we've got a problem here. There are federal regulations, there are state regulations, but there's a place for us. There's a gap we've identified, and we can come in here and be very effective with a local regulation. One of the pieces of the website that we've gotten the most positive response from is this page, and that is illustrating examples of local regulations that have already been enacted by local entities. It saves people from having to do a lot of homework. If you've got a seaplane issue, for example, there's an example of a local regulation that has already been enacted. And these are really powerful because, as all of you know, it can be pretty tricky to enact regulations, whether it be at the federal, the state, or the local level. So having these sort of tried and tested regulations that address specific pathways, and this is not comprehensive, and we'd love to keep adding to these. So if any of you know of any other local regulations that might address any of these pathways, we are more than willing to continue building this out. But you can click on those and see any series of cooperative agreements, statutory codes. There's all different types of local regulations and local documents that address some AIS specifics. We also did a really quick frequently asked question. You know, if you're a local municipality, where do I even begin? What do I need to think about? What are some advantages? And, you know, again, is a local AIS specific regulation necessary? The other piece that we've received some pretty good feedback on is this diagram that we created that illustrates the nexus between federal, state, and local regulations and authorities. So, you know, there are really important roles that federal agencies play with the Lacey Act, with ballast water management, with the Clean Water Act. And equally, there's some really important regulations at the state level about managing state lands and waters, noxious weed quarantines, felt soled waders, those types of things, drain plug rules. And then at the local level, there's some really important zoning codes and prohibited and controlled species lists and seaplane landing procedures. And then they can all cross or convene at one place. Where you can really think about the Clean Water Act with federal, state, and local authorities in protecting water quality. There's places where state and local intersect, like watercraft inspection stations or releasing aquatic invasive species to waters. There's places where just federal and local intersect, like federally listed noxious weeds. So we just wanted everybody to understand that there is a place for federal laws, there is a place for state laws, there's a place for local, and there's a place where each of those intersect or interact with one another, and there's a place where they can all come together and be very effective in addressing any issues. The other piece that we really enjoyed putting together was government AIS plans. So you can go to a number of websites right now and get state plans, or some federal plans, or some tribal plans. And what we've tried to do is pull a lot of that together in one place, just to give you a sampling of plans in large metropolitan areas. And the city of Portland has a really nice one, as does Minnesota, which has been very strong with AIS efforts. We put in a bunch of county plans. And again, you're gonna see Minnesota and Wisconsin are really strong in those areas of developing those plans. We put in some regional plans, water body specific plans, state government plans, of course, the big national plan, and a couple of tribal AIS plans that we were familiar with. We really wanted people to get their hands around the fact that there's a lot going on out there in understanding what that potential nexus is with a federal plan, a national plan, a tribal plan. you know, a state government plan, a county plan. There's a role for all of those. And if you're interested in advancing, you know, a local plan at some local level, whether it's water body specific, county specific, like Whatcom County in Washington, or something like Portland did as a large metropolitan area, there really are some great examples of that out there, and we wanted to share those with you. The next piece of the website talks about high-risk AIS, and we put a page together on pathways of introduction. This is the same model that we used when we developed the City of Portland's Invasives 2.0 plan, where it really focused on pathways, pathway specifics, and the likely kinds of organisms that could be transported through those pathways. We really want people to be focused on pathways. And a lot of times you can get lost in a lot of the details and a lot of the other things that are happening relative to aquatic invasive species in a local area. But we know that if we focus on pathways of introduction, and you focus your local codes and everything else on those pathways, you really can lessen potential introductions. And, you know, again, we know that many of the entities that are looking at this site likely have some experience with aquatic invasive species, and risk assessments is its own game in and of itself. But we did want to provide some information on that to get people thinking about risk assessment frameworks, pathway assessments, and that sort of thing. The piece of the site that we spent a lot of time on was the case studies. And so we're going to walk through each of these very quickly and two of these in a little bit more detail. Right now, we do have the City of Portland, Oregon as a case study. So for each of these case studies, you can click on the image for a larger version of the map on Google Earth. For each of the case studies, we provide some background information, human population, water bodies, links to important documents that the entity has developed to date, that sort of thing. And so as many of you know, because this one today is focused on the Pacific Northwest, the City of Portland has a number of water bodies, both the major Columbia River system, Willamette River, as well as a number of water bodies in and around the city itself. 10 years ago, the city had put together an invasive species plan. It was focused primarily on terrestrial species. And so they had wanted to conduct an audit of that 10-year plan and develop a new plan, Invasive 2.0, that was focused on all taxa, including aquatic invasive species. And so as part of that effort, we looked at, and one of the first things we did once we did the audit was look at the major pathways of AIS introduction to the City of Portland. And Steph, I think I'm going to turn this over to you now to talk about that analysis that you and your staff did.
Great. Yeah, thanks. So this was a really interesting, just from a legal perspective, to just think about how this analysis could be done. And so we started with the major pathways and sub-pathways and thought about, okay, so if we think that there is a risk of AIS spread from planes and helicopters, where does that authority rest on the local level? And then you need to step up to the state level, one, to make sure that there isn't a state law that preempts local governments, or there may be a state law that provides authority or incentives for a local authority to act. And so the way that we approach this analysis is that for each subpathway, we looked at what or who the responsible city and county department would be for that. So for planes, we're looking for airport authority. And in Portland, they do have a local airport planning rule. And then there's also a statewide law or regulation that, you know, provides the authority for that. But it did not explicitly apply to seaplanes. for that, or have anything really mentioning about invasive species risks. And so that was kind of what led to the recommendation, right? That for seaplanes, the responsible city department is the Port of Portland. There are state seaplane and invasive species laws. It doesn't preempt local authority. And so we recommended that the city consider applying, to the state aviation board to obtain authority for seaplane regulation, and then to amend local rules to address invasive species risks. The other things from planes can just be, what's happening with the planes as they're coming into the hangars, takeoff landings, different things. And so that's what we did for each pathway. We looked to identify the responsible city department, whether there's a state law or regulation related to that. So with ballast water, again, there are state laws. And then look to see whether the local authority had enacted anything to address that risk. In some, you'll see in later case studies, and here as well, like for hull fouling, the Port of Portland does have dock and boat ramp rules. And then, recommendations flowed from there.
Thanks, Stephanie. And so we looked at all of the different pathways and tried to develop a suite of recommendations for the city of Portland to consider. The other one we did, and I guess I should do Shasta next. Shasta in Northern California. And so this is a very large water body. They're very concerned about aquatic invasive species. They already have New Zealand mud snails. The Shasta Trinity National Forest has quagga zebra mussel alerts for the Shasta lakes. And then local governments have the authority to regulate, and determine a lot of what's happening around the lake. So it's a pretty complex kind of a situation with a national forest overlay on these local jurisdictions, with a lot of boaters coming from all different parts of California, Oregon, and other states as well. Shasta is a hugely popular lake. So Stephanie, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about any of these specific recommendations here.
Yeah, I would just point out, if you can see, when you go from Portland to Shasta, you can see there's a lot more blanks, right? And so for some local governments, because of the way that they're organized, it was not always clear whether there was a responsible city or county department. And so you see for the aviation pathways, there was no, their city zoning code did contain provisions relating to airports and landing areas, but there were no ordinances directly addressing airport operations. And so while the city planning department would have authority over like construction of airports, we couldn't find a city department that might be responsible for kind of overseeing operations of that. And that was true for some of the later pathways as well. And so throughout the case studies, again, because we strove for diversity in size and the way that local governments are set up, it's for some of them, it's not always easy to what authority should be identified. And so as Lisa said, we're updating this website. It's kind of a little bit of a living, site, and we're rolling these out. And there may very well be people on the call today from these jurisdictions that actually know who would be responsible for these activities. And so we would love to fill those in and add those as well.
Thanks, Stephanie. And the other cool thing, I think, is we tried to be as helpful to these local jurisdictions as possible with these case studies. So it wasn't like the recommendation is you need to develop a regulation. Like Stephanie tried to be really specific with, you can add a chapter to Title 5 or Title 12 of your existing regulations to address live bait sales. So we tried to be, really specific, add provisions to chapter 12.04 to prohibit the release of fish. So hopefully guiding folks, to those places and make it a little bit easier for them to consider potential changes that could strengthen their local regulations was important to us. The other study we did was Lake Fremont in Minnesota. Minnesota folks were just awesome to work with. They have a really strong program throughout the state of Minnesota, and in particular at the county and soil and water district level. This is about a 500-acre lake. It's only 5 feet deep. It's immensely popular for being such a small water body. It's also located a few miles east of Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge, where the refuge staff is interested in maintaining the integrity of their water bodies to support migratory birds. So this is really interesting. So there's a local city here that has management authorities. There's also a number of county entities there as well. And there's a fair number of nonprofits that are interested as well. So there's just quite a bit of active interest in AIS management. I would say not only at Lake Fremont, but in a number of water bodies in Minnesota. And so you can see we did the same thing here, where there's some places that are blank, and Stephanie explained why. But one of the recommendations for seaplanes, for example, is to consider adopting a city or county ordinance that requires seaplanes to follow aquatic invasive species best management practices. And of course, those are front and center on the National Seaplane website, as well as a number of other seaplane websites and a number of AIS websites as well. And there were a couple of places where we couldn't find a recommendation to suggest, but of course, in a number of places we could. The other case study we did was Smith Mountain Lake in Virginia. This is an incredibly large water body with a lot of residential homes on its edge. It has 500 miles of shoreline. It's surrounded by the Blue Ridge Mountains. They first detected non-native aquatic vegetation in 2001. They do have an aquatic vegetation program that's managed by a Tri-County Lake Administrative Commission. So that was kind of fun to navigate that and talk to the people associated with all of that. It's really a comprehensive program. It's pretty cool. They have a focus on a couple of specific species, hydrilla and curly-leaf pondweed. And they've got some really strong performance metrics to evaluate their AIS control efforts through time. So it's a pretty strong program, a lot of local active interest. But the interesting thing with this one is in Virginia, local governments can exercise powers only expressly granted to them by the Virginia Constitution or state legislature. So we were navigating the Smith Mountain Lake Association as well as the Tri-County Lakes Commission as we worked through this example. Couple of really strong pathways were planes and helicopters. And so you can see we had to look at quite a few jurisdictions, the city of Roanoke, Franklin County, Bedford County, and look at all of their laws and regulations. So that was pretty fascinating. In terms of hull fouling, we couldn't come up with much there. Stowaways, we found a few things where we could, through local Franklin County code, add some things. And in a couple of places you see initiate discussion with, because there are some really unique opportunities here for the Tri-County Lakes Commission to get with the Smith Mountain Lake Association to develop BMPs for a bunch of different things. We also suggested initiating some discussions on this example with anglers to get with the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation to include aquatic invasive species clauses in their special use permits for fishing tournaments, which they currently don't have yet. Land pathways, you can see they've got a pretty strong state regulation. And then for aquaculture, they do have a state law regulation on that as well. And so the last one we did was Smithville Lake in Missouri. This is a 7,100 acre reservoir. This has a nexus with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who administers this lake primarily for flood control. This lake is 30 miles from Kansas City. It's hugely popular. There's people from throughout the state of Missouri, in the neighboring state to the north and the west, that go to Smithville Lake to recreate and fish. And so there's some county regulation there. There's some local regulations as well. And so again, we looked at different pathways. Definitely some opportunity here, excuse me, to address things at the local level for planes.
And Lisa, I would just add that the Clay County, so that's an example, as I was mentioning earlier, there is an airport in Clay County. They already have tenant leases for their airport tenants. And so that's actually kind of a step down from a local ordinance, right? That they could add provisions to the tenant leases to address invasive species without necessarily needing a local ordinance adopted to do that, because they already have a code of an airport section in their code.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that, Steph. So there wasn't a lot to add to this one for recommendations. You know, you can see this website where we haven't put the finishing touches on it yet. And in fact, one of the great things about doing these webinars, and we're doing 3 for different regions of the country, is you guys are actually, as part of these webinars, in the question box, you're sending us links to other ordinances and things that we can add. So we really appreciate that. We anticipate once these 3 webinars are complete by the end of the month, we are going to put the finishing touches on this website. And then it's going to go to National Sea Grant Law Center to manage for in the future. So please use the question box to, if you've got any links you think we can add to any of these case studies, or any examples of local regulations. I know someone just sent us a really cool decontamination ordinance from Burnett County. So Tom, thanks for sending that to us. We'd like to keep building this out over the month of January and fine-tuning it and putting the finishing touches on it.
Yeah, and especially on the, I just mentioned, on the local regulations, you'll notice that we have some blanks, you know, some pathways that we looked at that we thought were important, like hydropower water intakes or kind of interconnected waterways, but we weren't able through our research to identify local ordinances about those. We know they may be out there, just wasn't using the right search terms or didn't find it. And so that's great that people are already sending us links, but especially for ones that we don't seem to have any for, we'd love to hear feedback on that.
Yeah, thanks, Steph, and thank you, Gary, for sending us that Town of Naples ordinance as well. And I want to give a shout out to Whatcom County in Washington, in Teagan Ward, and the work that those guys have done. Teagan sent us a lot of their ordinances and information last week. We've put this up on the website. They've done a ton of work. They've got years of experience at this. If any of you out there are considering developing local ordinances of any kind, I definitely push you in the direction of Whatcom County, specifically for AIS and watercraft inspection and decontamination programs at the local level. They've got years of experience and have done a fantastic job at that. So we would like you to, we're going to keep the webinar open for a few more minutes. You can ask any questions you'd like to ask in the question box. You can also send us And I want to put the PowerPoint back up here because we just want you guys to know that, you call it up here. It is not, there it is. You can send us at any time. So if you don't have time to grab a link now in the chat box, go ahead and send us. We put our contact information up here. Shoot us an email with any additional ordinances or local codes or regulations that you can think of. If you know of a local AIS plan, whether it's county, water body specific, anything like that, shoot it our way. We just had a question about how the toolkit's going to be made available. This toolkit is online right now. So we know there's some funky little spacing things right now, and we're continuing to add to it. But we did a soft launch because we want the AIS community out there to help us build it out and fine tune it. So it's live now, but your help is still welcome to, again, add more to it, add more content. We're even willing over the next month to add some more case studies. So if you've got a great case study that you'd like us to add to the website, contact us, and we'd love to build that case study out. Happy to do that. I think the more places in the country that we can show different kinds of examples, the more helpful it will be for a local municipality who doesn't have a lot of experience to look at one of those case studies and say, I can identify with that case study because. So yeah, the website is live, localgovais.com, and you guys can go to it now and play around with it. And we welcome all of your input. I don't see any additional questions in the question box. Stephanie, is there anything you would like to add?
No, I just say thanks everyone for joining us, and to echo Lisa's invitation that we welcome feedback, and we're still building it. We're still adding things to the cells on those spreadsheets. And so I look forward to hearing the feedback.
Thanks, Stephanie. And then we did have a question. Are there any plans to look at this for terrestrial species? Well, interestingly, Stephanie and I have been talking about that very idea for terrestrial, but also just thinking about, you know, now is there a way for us to think about federal, state, and local all together, and maybe even with terrestrial? It would be very cool to have something like that that's really focused on the regulatory aspect of this. As we worked with one of the entities, I believe it was Minnesota, it could have been Wisconsin, but I believe it was Minnesota. There was a lot of interest in us expanding this out beyond regulations to go to the more of the implementation phase. So in other words, this website and this project was focused on the regulatory aspect. And what they were asking us about was, but we have to navigate so much as we work with local nonprofits and homeowners associations and all of these other groups. Have you guys thought about taking it to that kind of phase? And we said, well, we think about it, but right now this project really was focused on the regulatory aspect. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Steph.
No, I think that's great feedback to know that, one, the approach to the website is useful, this type of pathway regulatory analysis. Yeah, Lisa and I would love to be able to do kind of comprehensive with both terrestrial and aquatic. I would mention that some of the pathways, the transportation, the airport, they are not necessarily focused on aquatic species. So that information could apply to both aquatic and terrestrial, but obviously we did not include all of the terrestrial pathways in the list.
Yeah, and we just had a fantastic suggestion from Cassandra Hageman. She, in terms of pathways, she asked if we considered the wildland firefighting equipment. And you know, we do have a lot of information that we've put together on wildland firefighting equipment. The Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, they've got a lot of information. It's currently on the westernais.org website. We could add that pathway for a couple of these because we do know a few of these water bodies are used for wildland firefighting water sources. So Cassandra, we will get that added to the website, and thank you for that suggestion. All right, I think that's it for the questions and comments. Again, please send us an email if you'd like us to add anything. A big shout out to Joanne Grady and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for supporting the effort. There's a lot of interest in this, and we really appreciate all the support of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So thanks everybody for taking time out of your schedules today. Stephanie and I really appreciate it, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you.